Hello everyone, Rich Hagan here. It says Randy Buehler's Guide to Block. That makes him Randy Buehler. Randy, welcome to the news desk again. I can't wait for this because Block's just about my favorite constructed format ever, and I think with lots of good reasons. I know that you love Block too.
Yeah, no, a lot of people think Block, well, you played at the Pro Tour, it doesn't really get a PTQ season, it may not get as much play as Standard or Modern, but I think this is the best format for the Pro Tour. I mean, certainly from the pros' perspective, it's a totally fresh slate. Nobody gets to just take decks from previous events. You kind of, as the super teams disappear into their secret lairs, they have the biggest edge in their ability to just solve a format. And so, yeah, no, I love Block Constructed. I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Why don't we get to the most basic question of all? What is Block Constructed?
Sure. So Block Constructed is essentially the smallest constructed format that's run. So we've only got Theros, Journey into Nyx, Born of the Gods. That's it. 579 different cards. That's not a lot of cards. It's a small environment, and with a small, compact environment like that at just 579, this means basic things might just be missing. There's no Supreme Verdict. There's no Wrath of God. There's none of that like White almost always has, just the 4-mana sorcery that kills all the creatures. Doesn't exist. You're like, oh, well, there's Drown in Sorrow, and there's Anger of the Gods, which sort of kind of qualify. I mean,
2 and 3.
They can only sweep the weenies, but they're in different colors, and so fundamental things like that can be different. Yeah, 579 cards, that's all we got.
It's not a lot, and as a player who played at a Block Pro Tour in Philadelphia 2005, I felt huge pressure because in Modern, there's 8,000 cards there. You're going to miss some. But when you can open, and you can do this at home right along with this, when you open the Theros Player's Guide and the Born of the Gods Player's Guide and the Journey into Nyx Player's Guide, and you know that every single card in the winning deck list is right in front of you, and all you have to do is work out which ones they are. That's pretty scary, and 579 is not a lot for sure.
It's interesting, though, that even though it's small, I think that if you look historically at the decks that have done well, it's really the good deck builders. They have such a huge edge in the format. Even though it's not that many cards, you'd think, oh, I don't have enough tools to work with, and that just hasn't been the way it plays out.
Why don't we see the history of Block Constructed? And I go a bit shivery at this because, oh my good Lord, there are some fantastic decks here. Yeah, Why don't you work us through some highlights?
You look back in the day, there have been 18 Block Constructed Pro Tours. I mean, this has been a staple. Just about every year that there has been a Pro Tour, there has been Block as one of the formats, all the way back to Ole Rade with that Spider deck in 1996. I mean, you look at some of the names of the decks that have done well at the Pro Tour. This is really where standard decks are born, and it's also where a lot of Hall of Fame careers can be born. The Cadaverous Bloom deck that Mike Long played in Paris was really the first combo deck. The Red Deck Wins deck that David Price used to win PTLA, really that's where Mono Red got its start, like Mono Red Aggro, Red Deck Wins, whatever you want to call it. Back in my day, we called it Dead Guy Red because Dave Price played for Team Dead Guy. Yep. That was really the archetype, Fire Blasts and Jackal Pups and whatnot. Casey McCarroll had the Academy deck that won that Pro Tour. It turns out Wintalarian Academy is in year 500 and whatever.
Quite good.
Yeah, the top 8 is a collection of different Academy decks. And sometimes you get a block monster, like Sigurd Eskelund wins his Pro Tour. Rebels was the format. The Mercadian Masks block, the Rebel deck was just by far the best deck, with something like 50% of the field.
And 7 of the top 8.
Not Sigurd.
Not Sigurd.
Sigurd Eskelund was essentially playing an anti-Rebels deck. And that's a thing that can happen in Block Constructed. If one deck starts to become a huge piece in the metagame, and you know it, okay, well, Sigurd played was a blue enchantment called Rising Waters, which is essentially a winter orb. It says at the beginning of each player's turn, they can only untap 1 land. Well, the Rebel decks are all about tapping a bunch of land to just chain into more Rebels, more Rebels, more Rebels, more Rebels. Rising Waters shuts the whole thing down. And then you look at that list, you want to talk about somebody who just figured out the metagame and solved it. The next Pro Tour after Sigurd's is the one that Zvi Malshewitz won with a deck called The Solution.
And The Solution featured Crimson
Oh my God.
Acolyte.
The cards in that deck are so terrible.
Yes.
Like you look at them, he's playing a 2-mana 1/1 with Pro Red and the ability to give other creatures Pro Red. But you know what? If everyone in the tournament is playing Red-Green, protection from Red's really, really good. Yeah, so Zvi just solved the Pro Tour.
So then we get Blue-Green Madness in 2002. Ken Ho, Mono Black Control was in that as well. And then Astral Slide, you talk about moving into Standard.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Astral Slide, of course, was what won Julian Naughton Worlds in
go.
2004. But in 2003, here's the core of it in Block. So let's go a little bit more recent than 2003. On we go.
Yeah, Affinity was the big deck the year that Kuroda won. Kuroda actually won with an anti-Affinity deck, kind of a red, blow up all the artifacts kind of thing. Gadiel Slifer wins with Gifts Ungiven in Philadelphia. That was the one you got to play, right?
Yeah, it was, briefly. Briefly.
Ravnica block, there was a team block constructed format. That was kind of a fun twist on block constructed.
That was where they could only fit 4 Simic Sky Swallowers across 3 decks, wasn't
Precisely,
it?
right. Basically, if you added all 3 decks together, it had to still count as a legal deck. So you only got sort of the 4 copies of each card. That's a pretty good team, right? Kaji, Yasuoka, and Saito. Guillaume Wafatapa wins with the control deck. His year, and you see start to see just so many familiar decks. The Jun deck really had its coming out party at that block PT. Jace the Mind Sculptor. Turns out, yeah, he's even better in block constructed where there isn't as much competition. Sharfman, Paolo, and Kazuya all actually won draft top 8s. That was one twist the block constructed Pro Tour took during its history. But yeah, the last 2 years, you see Alexander Hayne winning with a Miracles deck, very much control, and then Craig Wesco won the most recent block Pro Tour with his White Weenie deck in a field that was really sort of Sphinx's Revelation decks. But you know what? Not him. He knew how to beat the Sphinx's Revelation decks. You want to attack them with White Weenies.
There's something a little counterintuitive about block, because you would think with so few cards that on some level, well, the decks would be less powerful. And of course, in some sense, that's true. They are less powerful than modern decks, or legacy decks, or vintage decks. But because they're only playing against block decks, and particularly you mentioned the 4-mana Wrath that's missing, for example, it gives room in the format to do crazy stuff.
True.
Beastmaster Monument Green,
right?
You watch that and you were rubbing your eyes at this display of nonsense on that. That's right. And so if you haven't played block, I really encourage you to spend some time on Magic Online, because you will giggle uncontrollably at some of the nonsense you get to do with block decks.
I mean, for me, a lot of the allure is that fresh constructed, that it's almost like a blank canvas, right? I can play stuff that just doesn't work in any other format, and then I can also find the synergies that they're just going to turn into the standard decks that we're going to be playing for the next year and a half.
So, is block the home for deck builders?
Yeah, in my mind, yes, absolutely. I think that as a good deck builder, there's no format that gives you a bigger edge. You can look historically, Channel Fireball and Channel Fireball's Pantheon team are probably the 2 most obvious examples of super teams at this point. Go back and look at what they've done in the last couple of block PTs. The Pantheon managed to break, not last year, but the year before, they had a hexproof deck that, Finkel and Galdinas Vidugaris, they just piloted straight for the top of the Swiss. They refused to lose. Those guys just essentially broke the format.
Why don't we take a look at some of the elements for the deck builder's paradise, if you will, see what we've got coming. I keep looking at Craig Wesco and thinking, is he positioned to make a run again? There's a lot of good white cards. But here we are, let's take a look.
Yeah, there you see the Pantheon's hexproof deck that I was talking about. 5 guys entered the field. They took 2nd, they took 5th, and then 58, 91, 120. And honestly, I think they kind of got unlucky at the end. If you look at it with 2 or 3 rounds to go in the Swiss, 4 of those 5 guys were playing for top 8. And if you look at the end of the Swiss, Finkel and Gao were 1 and 2. Like, they were just above the Swiss. Didn't happen to win it, but still a great result. And similarly, look at Channel Fireball at the most recent Block Pro Tour, right? That's the one where Luis had to put up a top 16 in order to get platinum. Did it. The rest of his team, 14 for 14 advancing to day 2. They only got 1 in the top 8, but 10th, 11th, 18th, 31st, 32nd. CFB disappeared into their house. They come up with a great deck. I'm sure they're hoping that they've repeated that. I would not be betting against them. I mean, those are really 2 examples where 2 teams that if you had to pick coming in without really knowing what they came up with, those are the guys I wanted to know what they were playing first.
You said right up at the head of this that you felt that block was one of the real places where teams had an edge.
Sure.
But again, I come back to only 579 cards. In theory, that should favor the air quotes little guy who can, it's manageable in theory.
Oh, sure.
So why does it favor the team so much, do you think?
Nowadays, it really favors the teams because you only have 3 weeks. And there's just a limit to the number of decks that you can by yourself test. Like, you can't get in 10, 20 games with every deck you might think of. You really need teammates to help and sort of play out those matchups and try to figure out, okay, how does the metagame actually work? But yeah, it's the 3 weeks aspect. One guy, back in the day, you look at somebody like Zvi Mauschewitz, and the block-constructed PT wouldn't necessarily be snuggled right up against the set release the way it is now, and so somebody like Zvi Mauschewitz could just essentially make his career on block-constructed.
That's true. He was, of course, the winner of Pro Tour Tokyo 2001 with the solution deck. All right, let's move on. Let's see what we've got next. We can see that it favors good deck builders, and part of that is, well, there's very little info out there right now.
Yeah, you kind of know what people were playing on Magic Online a month ago. That metagame got relatively well explored, and the Junk Reanimator deck was not necessarily what maybe you were expecting, but you can dump stuff into your graveyard, you can bring it out with Whip of Erebos. Turns out, it may be a little clunky to be black and green and white and bringing Ashen Riders out of the graveyard, but you had somebody with an Ashen Rider once and gain 5 and destroy one of their permanents. It's pretty good. Black aggro, Esper control, red deck wins.
Right, so of those, you can clearly see, even just by reading the words aggro and control, and then Reanimator is very definitely a separate thing. It's based around the graveyard. You have all flavors of Magic right there. Historically, though, the Pro Tour chooses a deck that is prominent that they will not lose to. They set up and they say, and the classic one of this is White Weenie at Yokohama in 2007. Magic Online utterly dominated by White Weenie decks in the weeks leading up.
Sure.
And the whole Pro Tour went, I don't care what I do lose to, but I do care that I will not lose to White Weenie. That mono black aggro deck, the red super aggressive deck,
right,
is that the thing that has the target on, that teams are saying, this is what we won't lose to?
Well, I think that nobody's relying on Magic Online results right now because there's just so few of them.
Sure.
Journey into Nyx just went legal. People haven't necessarily had time to even accumulate all the cards yet on Magic Online. So, Mono Black Aggro is, I believe, the most played deck. Yeah, Mono Black Aggro is the most played deck right now on Magic Online. And sure, everybody had it in their gauntlet, but you're not confident it's going to be the most played deck this weekend. In fact, I would be surprised if it is the most played deck this weekend. I mean, it's in the gauntlet. I don't know that this format has one deck that everybody's like, okay, I know I'm going to see a ton of that. I got to make sure I don't lose to that. I actually think that this weekend, it's shockingly diverse. I can't remember a block-constructed format, again, only 579 cards, that had this many different archetypes that people were talking about as we kick things off.
I want to ask you about Esper Control.
Sure.
Because one of the truisms for control decks is that they are the decks that provide the answers to the questions that other decks ask. And the bit that's hard about playing a control deck is you need to know the questions in advance.
Sure.
How do you do that for block? How does playing a control deck really work when a format is so brand new?
Yeah, it's one of the places where having a team really helps. You want to know, okay, here are the 10 most obvious decks we can think of: black aggro, white weenie, maybe heroic. You try to put a constellation deck together. You put, your typical blue-white control deck together. You play those a little bit and you start to get a sense of which ones are viable. And, you do take a look at Magic Online. So I think that one of the questions you have to answer in this format is, what do I do about somebody attacking me with, gnarled Scarhide, into Pain Seer, into Herald of Torment? Like, I'm going to get attacked by that. That's one of the questions I know I'm going to have to answer. The other question I know I have to answer is Elspeth. Like, I think by far the most defining and sort of format warping card in the format is Elspeth, the Sun's Champion. She's just more powerful than anything else you can do in the format. Now, to flip that around, I actually think that Esper Control, it's the wrong way to answer the questions in this format.
Ooh.
Because the right answer to dealing with all those aggro decks involves blocking with Sylvan Caryatid and with Courser of Kruphix.
0-3s and 2-4s.
0-3 hexproof for 2, 2-4 life gain for 3, and some card advantage, right? If you want to play control in this format, I don't think, we'll see a little bit of Esper, we'll see a little bit of everything, but I think that most people who want to have answers rather than threats in their hands are going to start with green, and then they're going to start with black. And they're going to start with black because you want Hero's Downfall to be able to destroy Elspeth. So I've got my green, my 0-3 and my 2-4 to block the aggro weenies. I've got a ton of removal, Bile Blight and Hero's Downfall, which will help slow down the weenie decks, and then crucially, kill Elspeth.
One last question on that slide.
Sure.
It says red-green with Elspeth.
Right, I like that. I think that's the right description of this deck.
Well, sure, but that brings us on to the discussion of mana. I made the Inside R&D videos, which we'll be seeing tomorrow, talking with the guys who made the set. And they said about Journey into Nyx, Mana Confluence, bit of a thing, Temples, bit of a thing, because it just opens up the field to let you do red-green with Elspeth.
Yeah, definitely one of the defining characteristics of any block is what's going on with the lands. That's where you start when you're trying to understand the block format. And this block has pretty good lands. You know, the Cycle of Temples, that's a strong multi-land. There's not a sort of tier 2 multi-land cycle, but there is Mana Confluence. So if you're aggressive, you can be 2-color aggressive with a temple and a Mana Confluence. If you're 3-color, you need probably 12 temples. If you're controllers, you may not actually run Mana Confluence. You just may figure, well, it's not the end of the world if I only have 2 colors on turn 2, 3, 4, and I've got all these temples. So lands are very relevant. And yeah, the red-green Elspeth deck, that's actually another way that you can answer the weenie decks. Like, the reason that deck, and that deck has quite a good winning percentage on Magic Online, even though it's only sort of 4th or 5th most played right now, it's because you know what it beats? It beats the black aggro, and it beats the red aggro. It says, I've just got large monsters, I've got removal, and once I stall to 6 lands, I've got Elspeth, who's the most powerful card in the format. So,
all right, let's tie it all together then. Let's see what this means as we head in to Block Constructed. Take it away, Randy.
Right. 2 most powerful cards in my mind, Elspeth and Courser of Kruphix. I think you're going to see a lot of those cards. I think you're going to see a lot of brews. I mean, this really is a brewer's paradise. And, you know, I started thumbing through some of the deck lists during the limited rounds. I saw heroic decks. I saw red heroic. I saw blue-white heroic. I saw mono-white heroic. I saw a little bit of black heroic creeping into the black aggro decks, too. I saw constellation decks. There's a lot of people that are playing black-green with not just the Eidolon of Blossoms, but also the Doomwake Giant.
Sure.
So you're kind of sort of mid-range, kind of controlling, but ultimately you're a constellation deck. I even saw inspired decks, which I heard Josh Utter-Layton mention. I'm not sure we were expecting to see, what is Daring Thief? Is that the guy? That guy's crazy good. You could play blue-black inspired, and some people will. You will certainly see control decks. I think Bug is going to wind up being the best of the control decks. That's essentially black and blue and green. So you take black-green. I said you got to answer with black and green, right? So then the interesting question is, all right, I'm black and I'm green. I've got my answers here. You can either splash white for Elspeth, or you can splash blue for anti-Elspeth. And the card in blue, which I did not expect, but honestly I think it's important enough it could be on this slide for most impactful card, is Prognostic Sphinx.
The 3/5?
3/5, which means you can't kill it with Elspeth's second ability,
right.
And hexproof if you discard a card, so you can't kill it with anything else. Prognostic Sphinx is incredibly well situated, and so the control decks are not splashing white for Elspeth, they're splashing blue for Prognostic Sphinx, so they can attack Elspeth. And that's going to be huge. That's a lot of how this is going to play out.
Well, here on Magic the Gathering, we have prognostics, we have diagnostics, we have agnostics, and we have Block Constructed coming away. That was Randy Buehler's guide to Block.